Chapter 10. The big roan gelding had an eager, springy stride, and he tossed his head and snorted impatiently as Pat held him to a trot along the creek trail that led eastward from the ranch. The bay mare, laden with a pack saddle, trotted along docilely at the end of a short lead rope. Like Pat, she was a veteran of many long rides, and had long ago learned to conserve her strength at the beginning to have a reserve left for the end. At the right of the creek bed, low foothills rose upwards towards the jagged peaks of mountain range beyond. Knowing the entire country as he knew the palm of his hand, Pat planned to cut sharply south through those foothills along a abandoned ranch road that swung westward along the base of the higher mountains until it struck the main road south from Powder Valley, near a point where the main road began to climb through one of the few paths that led over the mountains. He didn't hope to reach that pass before Sam and Ezra, if that was their objective, but he could learn from a rancher near the foot of the pass whether the fugitives have passed that way, and would then know how to begin to plan for a chase. If they did strike due south over the high mountain pass, it would be a difficult matter to overhaul them. Pat knew they'd be well mounted, and they were two of the best horsemen in Colorado. That's why Pat had taken time to ride home and pick up a fresh horse and a lead animal. If the ride developed into a long chase, this would give him a terrific advantage over the fleeing men with only one mount apiece. Tired horses had to be rested and fed, and hard-riding men had to eat. With his camping equipment and extra mount, Pat was positive he could overtake his friends within a couple days if they were heading down into New Mexico. On the other hand, they were likely to realize their handicap in a straightaway ride, and then turn off the main road before they reached the pass. In that event, Pat knew pretty well where to look for them, for the trio had ridden all that mountainous country together in the past years, and Pat was familiar with every trail known to the other two. What they did largely depended on whether they expected Pat to take out after them or not. Without Pat on their trail, he knew they would feel fairly safe in turning westward off the main road and making their way at a leisurely pace towards a little-known pass west and thence on to the border. There were isolated range cabins scattered along that route where they could safely hole up for days at a time, and devilish back trails where they would be unlikely to meet any riders. What would Sam and Ezra expect him to do? That was a problem that caused Pat to knit his brows fretfully as he rode on at a brisk pace throughout the night. He tried to put himself in their place. The way that farewell note had been worded, it didn't sound as though Ezra thought he would try to follow them, but they knew him well enough, Pat reasoned, to realize that he'd feel duty-bound to ride on the trail of money stolen from the bank. Again, he realized that they didn't know Ezra had been recognized as the bank robber. He was certain Ezra didn't know that it was Pat who fired those warning shots over his head in the bank doorway, so they probably felt safe enough on that score. They knew Pat wouldn't bring them back for a hanging no matter what was done. It was all pretty much mixed up, and Pat gave up trying to untangle it after a time. When he reached the foot of the pass, he'd know which course they had taken. Until that time, any speculation was utterly useless. The monotonous thudding of hooves and the even motion of the roan lulled Pat's thoughts into sort of a drowsy lethargy after a time. He gladly welcomed the surcease of active thought. He had done too much damn thinking without getting anywhere, really. There was always too many things he didn't know about the whole setup. He wasn't used to dealing with men like Ralston and Dems. He couldn't figure them out. For the life of me, he couldn't see what they had in mind when Fred Ralston came on from Denver. He tried to recall exactly what Ralston had said, thinking that he was talking to Jeff Pardo, but his best recollection couldn't make any real sense. There had been some sort of plan to somehow get a hold of Sam and Ezra's money, but that all made sense that Pat could make out of it. It was quite evident that the plan had miscarried somewhere along, and Ralston's death had resulted. He still couldn't see for the life of him why Jethro had been killed. Ezra might have committed the act in a sudden fit of rage. There was a bit of a ruthless streak in the big one-eyed man that showed up sometimes when he was very angry. His reactions were almost childlike when it came to matters of right and wrong. If Ezra honestly felt that Jethro needed to be killed, he'd be capable of doing the job just as he'd calmly put a bullet into the head of a crazed coyote, or a beloved horse who had broken his leg and had to be put out because of pain. It might not be right according to civilized standards, but Pat had always had a lot of difficulty making Sam and Ezra believe in civilized standards. He had never been able to make them see that it was best to bring a criminal to trial for his acts. In their forthright way, they believed that the best way to dispose of a guilty man was to shoot him at the first opportunity, an effective method of keeping order, but a little bit old-fashioned, even for Powder Valley. In this way, Pat's thoughts went around in a ceaseless circle, as though they were inside a vacuum while he dozed along in the saddle. The roan had gotten rid of his coltish ideas after a few miles from the old ranch house road and had settled down to a steady and seemingly tireless slope which put distance behind him at an amazing rate. When Pat finally shook himself out of his drowsiness and sat up in the saddle to look around, he was surprised and pleased to see that dawn was already beginning to break over the rough foothill country through which he was riding. There was faint red glow in the cloudless eastern sky, and nearby objects were beginning to emerge from the enveloping dark that had come when the moon disappeared behind the high peaks of the western horizon. Pat stared about him thoughtfully for a time, trying to place his exact position on the old road. His direction now was a little south of west, which meant that he was veering around to the base of the southern mountains and was only a few miles from meeting the main southern highway which Sam and Ezra had taken out of Dutch Springs. Daylight came on with an amazing speed in the high country after the night blackness reluctantly gave way to dawn. The red blush spread swiftly over the sky, deepening to violet crimson near the horizon, and sending out laces of yellow as the sun moved up to the very rim of the world. There, then, was a blazing ball of fire, and the tall, feathery tops of pine trees caught the flame of a new day. His horses tossed their head approvingly, and moved a little faster as the smell of water came to them, and Pat quickly decided to stop for a brief breakfast when they reached the small stream up ahead. He was really in no great hurry. If Sam and Ezra had followed the southern road this far, they would already be well up onto the pass, and if they had swung off westward as he suspected, he would surely be able to come up to them by nightfall. In either case, Pat knew it was smart to break his ride into short stages, with a brief rest and feed for both himself and the horses before either became too weary to keep up the pace. He reined off the road under a pair of aged old cottonwood trees on the bank of a gurgling stream, and swung out of the saddle lightly. He loosened the girth and pulled the heavy rig off, and stripped the blanket from the sweaty roan and looped a rope about his neck. He pulled the bridle off, gave him a slap on the haunches to send him trotting down to the stream for a drink, and then went back to the patient bay and slid the pack saddle off her back. He tethered both the animals where they could get water and graze in the lush grass that grew alongside the stream, and then built a tiny fire of dry sticks that gathered along the bank, carefully laid on larger sticks to build up a bed of coals, and took his smoke-stained coffee pot to the stream above the horses and filled it half full of clear water, only a few degrees above freezing point. He threw a man-sized handful of coffee into the pot, placed it on the fire with burning sticks piled up all around it, cut 2 thick slabs of fat salt pork from the slab that Sally had provided, and put them on the fire in the frying pan with a small quantity of water to boil out the excessive salt before frying. There was cold biscuits in a gunny sack to complete his breakfast, and Pat squatted on one heel to roll and light a cigarette while the sow belly boiled gently in the coffee pot began to send out its appetizing aroma. After he'd smoked one cigarette, he poured the water off his fat meat and then put it back on the fire to fry. The coffee was boiling merrily, and so he raked a few glowing coals to one side of the fire and set the pot on them to simmer and settle, and then began to turn his meat with a long-handled fork. No more than 20 minutes after he had reined aside under the cottonwoods, Pat was munching a cold biscuit with a slice of crisp pork between the two halves and washing it down with huge draughts of strong, steaming coffee. And not more than 40 minutes had lapsed in all when he was back in the saddle with his few camp things again packed securely on the bay mare, headed westward to the junction with the southern road. He didn't bother to try and read any trail signs when he reached the road an hour later. Too many riders rode this route to make it feasible to try and pick out the tracks of any single pair. The ranch of Lon Estes was only a 2-hour ride up the pass, and with the road running right through Estra's yard, it was impossible for anyone to pass that way without being seen. Lon came out of his barn to greet Pat Stevens when the sheriff got off to open his back gate 2 hours later. Lon Eston was a big man with a sweeping black mustache and completely bald head. He looked appraisingly at the dust-streaked roan and the pack-saddled mare and drawled, "'Pears you figured on making a long ride, Sheriff." Pat replied, "That's what you're going to decide for me. Heard anything about the trouble in town last night?" "The bank robbing?" Lon Eston nodded placidly and backed up to a fence post to scratch his back. "Harry Tyler rode past about an hour past sundown. Say there's been sure hell a-poppin'." "Anybody else pass before Harry?" "Well, now, I don't reckon so, Pat. I wasn't up till most daylight, but I didn't hear Jiggers barking none during the night. Jiggers, he never misses, waking me when somebody rides through." Pat knew that Jiggers was Lon's dog, a huge, rough-haired brute counted as one of the finest watchdogs in the entire valley. Pat nodded his relief and said, "I reckon maybe it won't be such a long ride after all if no one's been through here then." "Harry told me about the posse losing that feller," Lon said. "Seems like there was a killing or two in town as well, wasn't there?" "There was 2 of them." "And they tell me you're still wearing the sheriff's badge, Pat. Are you on the trail of something?" "I will be. After I've ridden back a ways, I figure they must have turned off west." "Know who they might be?" "I've got a good idea." Pat met Lon's inquiring eyes squarely. Lon nodded and picked up a twig and began chewing on it. It was evident to him that Pat didn't wish to discuss either the bank robbery or the murders. After a short period of mascuration, he said earnestly, "I'm sure looking for that Pony Express to be coming through here. Gonna be sorta less lonesome like." Pat roused himself from his thoughts and replied, "There'll be a station not so far down the road from here is what I reckon." "About 5 miles. They got change stations scattered every 10 miles between El Paso and Denver. That's what they tell me. This one down the road," he added casually, "is the one Ezra's gonna have charge of, and Sam SLOAN will be riding the 10 miles into Dutch Springs and back every day." Pat looked at the rancher sharply to see if his mention of Sam and Ezra carried any knowledge of the part that they had played in last night's affair, but he couldn't get no hint from the impassive expression with which Estes met his gaze. Sam ought to make a good express rider. He don't weigh but 120 soaking wet. Yeah, Sam, he'll do good, Lon agreed. Pat squatted down and picked up a short piece of stick. A vague idea was beginning to come to him. He thoughtfully formed some brands in the soft ground with the piece of the stick, a lazy J and a flying T. Then he made a B, bar B, and put some wings on both the B's, and Lon Eston watched him with casual interest. Some folks in Dutch Springs have got an idea that Sam ain't going to be riding the mail today. Oh, that's so? Is Sam sick? Lon looked surprised. No, it ain't that. Pat dropped a stick and rolled a cigarette. Just some things that Sam said, I reckon, are done. Oh, that's so? Pat nodded. Would you do me a favor, Lon? You bet. You want me to saddle a horse and ride with you after them robbers? Pat shook his head. I'm taking care of that myself. You figuring on going into Dutch Springs any time today? Well, now, I could, I reckon. Lon rubbed his chin, regarded Pat soberly. I'm kind of short on tobacco. If you do ride in, said Pat carefully, I wish you'd tell folks that you talked with me this morning. Sure, I'll do that. Anything else in particular? Yeah, I'm telling you flat that Sam SLOAN's going to ride for mail this afternoon. Don't make no mistake about that. And I'd like mighty pretty well to have that piece of news spread about Dutch Springs good, so that everyone knows it. Sam's gonna ride the mail? Lon Eston repeated in a tone of perplexity. All right, Pat, I'll scatter the word around. And don't say I told you particular to tell it. Just say we was talking, and you mentioned something about hearing that he wouldn't be making the first express ride, and how I rose up on my hind legs and said he would. Pat's voice was quietly emphatic. I got you, I reckon. What for you want that told in town? Pat looked down squarely. Do you trust me to know what I'm doing? Sure I do. All right. I'd rather you didn't ask no questions. Just tell that where it'll be scattered about town good. In at the Gold Eagle and up at the Jewel. Kitty Lane would like mighty well to know it as well, if I reckon. Lon grinned broadly. They do say that Sam's got a real case on Kitty. Pat grunted a non-committal, and he got up and stretched. Well, I better be riding if I'm going to be after that bank money. You sure you know what you're doing, Pat? Going at her alone? I'll make out. Thanks, Lon. Pat went out of the back gate and closed it, and mounted his roan and started back at a fast trot along the road leading down to the foot of the steep pass. End of chapter 10.